Thank you very much. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd, and I've spoken before. You might have heard me talk about my research into co-housing and collaborative living. Well, today I'm going right to the other end of the spectrum and talk about some research we've done into very big new housing schemes in London. And then Melissa will look at the other end of the spectrum and talk about OWCH. So I'm going to talk about some work we've done on high-density new housing schemes in London. So you might think this is an unusual topic to talk about at a Green Architecture Day, but actually I think it's really important to look at what is actually being built. The majority of the new construction being built in London is at much, much higher densities than historically we've had in the city. What does that mean for the people who are living there? How do these places function as homes? What kind of people live in them? Very little of this was known because so much of this kind of construction is very new. So the GLA, the Mayor of London, asked us to do some research looking at high-density housing projects in London. So our questions were how residents experience living in high-density housing, and on the technical side, we defined high density as at least 150 units per hectare. Measuring density can be quite a difficult thing to do because it depends where you draw the line as to how many hectares you have. But most of the schemes we looked at were well above that. And all of the schemes that we looked at had over 200 units, and some had several thousand. So we're asking what do residents think of living there? What makes them perform well or badly as homes? And what lessons can we draw? And although the research wasn't explicitly about sustainability, that wasn't the main focus of it, we did have some very interesting findings about the sustainability features of these schemes. So you're probably all at least have a general familiarity with London. I know that you can't see the details of this map, but this is just to give an indication of where the schemes are located. This is the north and south circulars. It's not all of the 32 London boroughs. So this is inner London, basically. And the furthest west, is there a pointer thing? No. The furthest to the right, there are three together. Those are Pimlico. So those are the furthest west. Everything else we looked at was in the eastern half of London, and that very much reflects where development is in London now.
The red button is a pointer.
The red button is a pointer. Oh, yes. Okay. Oh, yeah. So those are some 3 historic places in Pimlico. So we looked at 11 recent schemes occupied in the last 10 years and 3 older ones. And about half of the recent ones did boast some green features. So I'll tell you about those. Strata at SE1, this is the tower at Elephant and Castle that has 3 windmills, turbines at the top. Those of you who know the building might also know that the turbines have not turned since about the first week that the building was in operation. You hear different reasons as to why that is, but it's either to do with the vibration or the noise. So that's been occupied for 8 years, and it has 400 units. Hale Village is in Tottenham. It has 1,200 units, and it has green, it very much markets itself as a sustainable development. It has green roofs and wildlife corridors and an energy center fueled by wood chips, and it's code 4 for sustainable homes. East Village is the former Olympic Athletes Village at Stratford. It was built for the 2012 Olympics. It has a kind of wetland area, a little stream running through it, has very good energy efficiency and lots of green space. Pembury Circus in Hackney is an interesting one because this is Europe's largest car-free development, and it also has a low-carbon energy center. Woodbury Down is an estate regeneration scheme in Hackney. It's on the northern side of Hackney, overlooking 2 man-made reservoirs that have now been turned into wildlife refuges that are managed by the London Wildlife Trust. And they also have green roofs, lots of native landscape plantings, and a sustainable drainage system. So those are the ones that had explicitly sustainable features. We also looked at 5 more new ones that didn't have any particular eco claims. Those are the ones circled. And then these 3 historic estates, all of them in Pimlico, as a kind of contrast, because we wanted to compare how these places that have been occupied for at least 70 years compared with those where residents had just moved in the last 3 or 4. So who lives in these places? Well, you might think that's a kind of trivial question to ask, but actually it isn't, because the statistics that we have are not, it's not possible to look at existing statistics by development. You can look at them by ward, but the boundaries very rarely coincide. So the only way we could find out who lives in them is by surveying the respondents, and so we sent out survey invitations. And we found that they're about 50% owner-occupied, 35% private rented, and 15% social rented. 71% of the respondents are between 20 and 40, and most of them lived in households with only 1 or 2 children. So the kind of broad brush generalization is that these are the sort of young working people, single professionals, either sharing or living in couples but without children. 14% of the respondents had children. That was less than half of the proportion in London as a whole. And when we looked at 3 of these schemes have tower blocks, that is, that have buildings that are more than 20 stories tall. And if you looked at who lives in the tall buildings, only 4% of those people had children. Most of the respondents were from the UK. Those who weren't were usually from Europe. And we had a very big range of incomes, from people who said they earned less than £10,000 a year for their whole household to those earning more than £150,000. The main reasons people gave for moving to these places were that the biggest one by far was the good quality public transport. A lot of these places are located right on top of a tube station, and they're very, very accessible. We also asked people if they owned a car. So car ownership in London, about 54% of households own at least 1 car, whereas in the people that we surveyed, only 21% of households owned a car. So I think that's a very powerful indicator of how good the transports it can be if you're located right on top of a transport node. We also asked people if they didn't own a car, why didn't they own a car? And the biggest response was, I don't need a car because public transport is good. Second reason was given for moving to the area was price, and the third was neighborhood. We didn't ask about sustainability features as a specific question in most of the survey, but we did on 2 specific schemes that had very claims about their green energy. We asked, was that a factor in moving to those schemes? And as I recall, only 2 respondents out of about 130 said that it had any impact on their decision to move to the scheme. It was the lowest proportion. Looking at questions of design, we asked people, what do you like about living in X, the name of the scheme? And this was a free text question. They could write whatever they wanted. Interestingly, in the new schemes, the most common word that people put was they liked it because it was modern. And this is maybe a bit surprising to those who think that there's a cultural preference here for older homes. Well, that may be a kind of general thing, but clearly for the people that were living in these schemes, modernity was a plus. So maybe that's a cultural shift, or maybe it just shows that the market is segmented. A lot of people also specifically said that they really liked the integration of green space with the buildings in their schemes. And this was a much more, we heard this much more from people who were living in big master planned communities where the greenery was an integral part of the scheme. And a lot of these were big developments that are starting to be occupied now, but really are going to continue to be built for the next 15 or 20 years. So those include East Village, which is the Olympic Athletes Village, Hale Village in Tottenham, and Woodbury Down, all of them that are going to have many thousands of homes. We asked people how often they use the outdoor space, and the response varied a very great deal, I think, depending really on the quality, on two things, the quality of the outdoor space and whether people were used that outdoor space as a way to access their front doors. So Lillington Gardens, which is a very well-known 1970s design in Pimlico, it's grade 2 listed, and the doors open onto these beautiful gardens. 47% of the respondents said they use the outdoor spaces more than once a week, whereas Thurston Point, which is an all-rental development in Lewisham, this courtyard is up on a podium, and you don't enter through the courtyard. You enter underneath the podium and go straight up in lifts to your flat. So you have to make an extra journey to go out into this space. And we went and did some observations there, and it seemed to be totally sterile. We never saw anyone using it. We were interested to the degree to which people are attracted by all the shiny amenities and facilities that some of these new schemes offer. A lot of them have residents-only gyms, some of them have pools, a lot of them have co-working spaces or cafes or a whole range of things, roof gardens often. They're emphasized a lot on the marketing material, but what we heard from the respondents was that they were really not very important in their decision to move to those places as homes. We did look at two schemes that were on top of a supermarket. The supermarket occupied the whole ground floor because the GLA was interested to hear whether people thought that was a negative. The only comments we heard about that were positive. People loved the convenience. And they agreed that these high-density developments offered good services and amenities. So, physical issues. There were three main physical issues that people had problems with. One is storage. They said that there just wasn't enough storage. Two, and this is interesting from a kind of green architecture point of view, was overheating. Because the building and planning regulations require that almost all these schemes have double glazing, and many of them have central heating systems that the residents have some control over the temperature in their own flats, but no control over the public areas and so on. And a lot of them said that overheating was a really serious problem, especially in corridors. And we have a photograph of one woman holding a thermometer standing outside the door to her flat, and it says 32 degrees. And that wasn't even in the summer, actually. It was in the spring. Community, not surprisingly, people knew their neighbors better in the older schemes in Pimlico than in the new schemes that had recently been built. But people said that community wasn't one of the reasons that they chose a home, that they were more interested in issues of convenience and price. In some schemes, people moved in because they loved the neighborhood. That was especially the case in Pembury Circus, which is in Hackney, and in Greenwich Creekside, which, despite the name, is in Deptford. And another said they moved in despite the neighborhood, and that was the case in Barking and in Woodbury Down, which is in another neighborhood of Hackney. Okay, last few observations. As I've already said, relatively few of the residents have children. From looking at the historic estates, which are the three in Pimlico, one was built in 1902 to house the people who were displaced from actually where LSE is now. When Kingsway was built, there was a big slum clearance, and the people who moved from Kingsway moved into the Millbank estate, which is behind the Tate Modern. One is the Tatchbrook Estate near Pimlico Tube Station, and the third is Lillington Gardens with the lovely gardens. These are similar built densities to some of the new estates that we looked at, but people emphasized that they liked them because they were not towers. Two of these three estates are now mixed tenure through right to buy. It seems to be generally working, although there are some tensions and resentments. Flats in the Millbank estate now, which is about 60% right to buy, sell for over £1 million, but they're still about 40% social tenants. But on the whole, residents feel privileged to live in these places. In general terms, there was not a great deal of pushback against the density of these places themselves. And in fact, a lot of the people who answered our survey said they had never really thought of themselves as living in high-density housing. That wasn't the defining characteristic of the housing as far as they were concerned. So 82% thought they were a good solution for housing going forward, and 63% said they intended to remain for a long time. So finally, I went and pulled out some of the sustainability findings from the research, which, as I said, wasn't the main focus, but we did have some, especially material from interviews about this. So sustainability considerations generally did not drive the decisions to move to these places. Some sustainable features were highly valued, and especially high-quality green space was something that residents really liked a lot and used when it was well designed. But some were seen as superfluous marketing exercises like the strata windmills, or even as negatives, the heating systems that residents didn't understand or feel that they could control. So that's a view from the very, very large new developments that are going up in London. Now I'll hand over to Melissa, who's going to tell us about one of the smallest.
Okay, hi. I'm standing in as well today for Maria Brenton. So I've been asked to introduce cohousing, not just the bit that I was going to do about OWCH and the research that we've been doing for the past 2 years. So very briefly, I just wanted to give a kind of overview of cohousing. It might be that you've discussed this already today. If so, I'm sorry for repeating myself. But basically, this is, according to the UK Cohousing Network, what cohousing is. These are intentional communities created and run by their residents. What is important, I think, and definitive about cohousing in relation to other forms of community-led housing that has to do with design is that it always has a combination of individual flats with a so-called co-house, and that co-house can look very differently depending on the development. But the important thing is that residents will share activities, co-manage, and really kind of appropriate and empower themselves through these shared activities in a particular space that is designed for those purposes. And that exists in combination with their own individual private flats. All right. So this is actually a bit dated. There are now more co-housing sites than when I produced these slides originally, so I'm sorry about that. But just to give you an overview of where co-housing, which is a very niche kind of development still within the housing market in the UK stands, especially if we compare it to co-housing in other European countries, particularly the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark. France is also moving very quickly policy-wise in terms of encouraging co-housing. The UK is moving forward, but it's still very much lagging behind its European counterparts. And also, the ideologies of co-housing groups will vary widely, even if we have very few still in the UK. The group that I'm going to be talking about is the Older Women's Co-housing Group that you may know about because they've gotten a lot of media attention. They are the only senior co-housing group in the UK at the moment, and they are a women's only group, which also makes them very, very distinctive. So that's a snapshot. And the reason that there are many cultural reasons, but some of the reasons why this is so difficult to turn into kind of a mainstream development in the UK has to do with the very long and arduous and involved process for residents in developing co-housing. Finance, of course, is one of probably the most quoted issue for both groups and individuals that want to get involved in these kinds of schemes. The novelty of these schemes means that there's a very steep learning curve for everybody that's involved, and this takes a very long time, and often the wheel gets reinvented because people want to be very involved, and rather than wanting to just grab lessons from other groups, they want to do it themselves. And so it's a kind of catch-22 position, because you want to move quicker and you want to be able to develop more, but at the same time you want to be very involved and you want to do it in the way that, you know, your group decides over time. And then the planning, building, and financial systems in this country, which really don't mesh very well yet with collaborative housing, including co-housing. Oh, sorry. So senior co-housing in particular, which is defined as the over 50s, is a relatively new addition to the UK ecology of co-housing. It is gaining ground. OWCH has been hugely important in that sense in terms of giving it visibility and other groups wanting to take it on. And one of the reasons that senior co-housing is flouted as something that's positive for the future is because it helps to prevent loneliness and it provides informal systems of care amongst its residents, particularly at a time in this country where, you know, austerity policies and crises of healthcare mean that, you know, individual citizens are having to kind of take matters into their own hands, if you will. And so senior co-housing provides a partial solution to this, if you will. What we noticed as researchers and what stakeholders from a wide range of different areas were telling us when Kath and I were studying co-housing groups and development in London, before studying OWCH, was that there wasn't really a systematic assessment of health and well-being. So this is one of the main and major claims that the co-housing movement makes, not just in this country, that co-housing will improve your health, it will improve your well-being. But there are actually no longitudinal studies about this, and there's very little data out there, systematic data. So OWCH really, just to introduce who they are and why we became involved in it, it was as a response to that call for a need for more information, really, as to what was going on in terms of health and well-being. This was a wonderful opportunity. This group, after 18 years of development, finally moved in 2016, and we kind of were able to secure access to them right at the beginning, and we've been able to follow them now for about 18 months. They're located in Barnet in North London. Like I said, for 18 years, because of all these barriers they've been developing. It's a mixed tenure community. They have 25 households, 26 residents, a co-house or a common room, and it's crucially mixed tenure. And one of the reasons that it took them so long to develop is because the women insisted on having mixed tenure. And this was obviously more costly, and they were lucky in a way. And this is one of the questions about the replicability of co-housing. They got a grant from the Tudor Trust, which allowed them to put in those 6 mixed tenure flats, or sorry, 8 social housing flats. Had they not had that grant, they wouldn't have been able to do it. And so there's a question there as to how we replicate that into the future. And even though it's defined as senior co-housing, one of the things that we found, people very quickly say, oh, well, that's just for old people. But in fact, it can be defined as intergenerational. You have a wide range of ages from 50 all the way to 89, I think, at the moment, and everything in between. And in planning for their legacy, they take these age ranges into account, so they make sure that all of the age ranges are represented. And they think about that in terms of new membership for the future. And this is just a quote here about what the women describe as being their motivating factor for being part of these groups. It conveys their kind of ethos about how they want to age differently in this country, how they want to do aging in a different way with a lot more agency, but also in a cooperative and mutual aid mode. So it's really about them, in a sense, taking control over their future, not feeling like they're just going to some form of residential care home where others are taking care of them, but they're taking care of one another and living more relationally. So I'm just worried about time. How much do I have at the moment?
Sorry, I'm not paying.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Absorbed.
That's
We don't have
absolutely
much-
fine.
Too much longer.
No, I just want to make sure I go over everything in the research. Maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes or so. Well, anyway, 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah, under 10 minutes.
Under 10 minutes, yeah. Okay, fine. So this is the bit where I'm introducing what we've been doing with OWCH specifically over the last 18 months. So like I said, there was this need to capture in some way how really there is, if there is, an improvement in people's health and well-being. So we have been focusing on those aspects of life since the women moved into OWCH and immediately before they moved in. We wanted to develop a baseline assessment of the demographic and their physical and mental health profile, not just to study them, but in the future, and we have this very large grant application that we're waiting to hear about, to be able to compare them then to other groups across the country, and hopefully we will be able to do that soon, and to explore the links between physical and emotional health and new ways of living, and to see whether it truly did prevent loneliness or whether it's fostering different kinds of relationality, and how mutual care actually takes place in practice. What I wanted to present now very briefly on are the bits about sustainability in our research. We're not just looking at health and well-being in terms of physical health and emotional health, which we are, of course, but also in terms of the built environment and how the women relate to that and how they feel that they're getting on, if you will, with their building. And the way that we've tried to study that is through these methods. So we have interviews, we've done questionnaires, we've done focus groups, and we have journals that the women have kept over the first 12 months of their life there, with very specific questions about things like energy performance, their green behavior, how they're feeling about their flats, how successful they think that their building is, etc. And this is some of what we have done in terms of being participative researchers with the women. That's the only way that they allowed us to do the research, is to work with them. So one of the things has been a kind of learning your building, post-occupancy building monitoring, which is about understanding women's perception of the space in relation to thermal perception and CO2 levels, and to see how this varies from the norm. We wanted to really understand how the built environment, how important it is to their perception and to the community life. We've had a UCL master's student do a project on this, and we have 2 sustainability experts, architects in London that are also working on this side of the project. So we're monitoring external temperature, we're monitoring the temperature and the relative humidity with data loggers inside women's flats, in their bedrooms and in their living rooms, and the carbon dioxide levels in the interior of the dwellings. In addition to that, the architects that are involved in the project have done this kind of learning your building workshop with the women. So they realized very quickly that despite the immense amount of co-design practice that went into this project, the women didn't really understand how their flats worked or how their buildings worked. They understood that there were some green elements there, but they didn't really understand how they could take over it. So these architects that are in the research project tried to do a bit of training for them in terms of helping them understand the building better and helping them understand their flats and how heat worked, etc. And what came out of this is that really they didn't understand. They needed much more than the one day that we could give them, in a sense, for free. And that's one of the things that I think we need to think about more into the future. Like I said, OWCH has had huge media attention, partially, perhaps most importantly, not just because it's the first senior women's co-housing, but because it's won all of these design awards. And PTEA, who is the firm that has developed this co-design process, now is using it for other co-housing groups or other community-led projects. And this very engaged co-design practice has been really key to the way that the OWCH women define what they turned out being, right? Because they were participative all the way from the design of the building, but before that, with the social design as well, of course, of their group. And part of what they did in the social design was set out some environmental principles and environmental goals that they tried to kind of convey to the architects, and the architects also to them, so that the scheme's material design would speak to those desires to be more green, to be more sustainable, which is in their policies actually. So things like attention to the heating systems and control, to having mechanical ventilation systems, energy meters, as well as having recycling policies, and crucially, a belief in sharing economies. So the co-house is there as a way for them to cook together and to have meals together, for instance. So there's the sharing of food, there's the sharing of cars. They have limited parking, and they actually co-own some of the cars. And so this is a kind of overlaid image from the architects about some of those shared spaces. The laundry also, there's a shared laundry, but crucially, because they each had flats, they also decided to have their own individual laundries. So sustainability, therefore, is a kind of recognized value amongst the women, and it's there in the built environment. And this is just some of the words of the women in describing how green goals and values are very much central to their life in OWCH. They have solar paneling, they want to live more ecologically. Some more about green goals and values. They're saying that they care about the environment. They're very energy conscious. They have a very energy conscious ethic. However, crucially, things like recycling were not the same for everyone, right? So for some people, it was a huge motivational factor. For others, it wasn't a motivational factor at all. In fact, when I asked that question to the women in both sets of interviews, most of them, I would say, said that yes, it's a value, it's something we care about, but not as much as other principles. And I know I have very little time, so I just wanted to say something about once they moved in, then what happened with these what has happened so far with these principles and these values, and with the built environment. And really, one of the main things is that there have been massive defects in the building that has to do not really so much with the design, but more with the contractors. So things like the soundproofing of the common roof had to be completely redone after they moved in. All of the balconies and all of the flats had to be taken down and put up again. We're 2 years in, and the builders are still there. So to give you an idea of the extent of the works that have had to be done. Some of the women have complained also about the design. For instance, they hadn't thought about the fact that the parking is right below some of the balconies, so they're getting a lot of pollution into their flats. Some of the tiles that were laid out in front of some flats are very slippery, and we're talking about older women who are aging, and they've had to put their own group finances into redoing these tiles. That's also the case for some of the canopies that they've had to install because actually the way that the sun is coming in is overheating their flats, even though those things had, in theory, been addressed during the co-design process. So this is just something about, the defects. I think what I really wanted to stress in terms of lessons about the defects is that the women didn't really plan to have so many defects. They didn't really have any thought process before as to this being a possibility, and they have had to spend 2 years of their life and their group finances in addressing these defects, and they feel very worn out. A lot of them talk about their health and well-being in relation to these defects now, the strain, the stress, and the energy levels that they've had to put into just getting the building, rather than the kind of social life that they had expected underway. That's not to say that they're not very happy with how the social side of things are going on, but in terms of the building per se, this is one of the issues. Accessibility in the design has also been a major issue, so the doors actually were not wheelchair accessible doors for some reason, so they've had to now go back and use their money again to address this, and that's very surprising, right, in terms of a senior group that co-designed a senior co-housing scheme. And then recycling, finally. Like I said, the principle is there, but the way that women are invested in certain practices will vary widely. And this is particularly true with recycling. And what I would say is that some women who came in with the most energy to try and teach the other women about recycling, they've had to kind of tone down, for a number of reasons, their recycling ethos, because they've been, well, for many reasons. And some of the other women say that they've actually learned to recycle, which they never did before. So there's a kind of leveling out, and I think that that's very true in co-housing, and that there has to be a kind of flexibility to your principles if you want to get on with what are actually a wide range of ideologies and ideas and people, etc. So just to finish, to say that sustainability in the OWCH scheme, and I think in co-housing we could say, is really not spatial. It's about the social. And so designers, even though they've been thinking with the women in the co-design process, I think need to think a bit more actively about how aging happens and what elements of the built environment have to be made responsive to this aging process. For the women themselves, sustainability is really about social sustainability. They see the success of the buildings as the success of the group. And so for them, it's all tied in, and it's about legacy and how you teach the new women coming in, if anybody passes away, for instance, about these core ethos and buying into them in a way that will keep them alive rather than have them kind of fizz out over time. So it's about a willingness to learn in the process, but also to teach others as new members come in. I'm going to leave it there because I'm aware of time.